Good morning, everyone. I hope you're caffeinated and hydrated and ready for this important panel. So welcome to this session on conflict management and regional diplomacy in the Middle East. As I said, a very important panel. The Middle East today is experiencing a period of deep uncertainty, change, but also of adaptation, I would say. Across the region, governments and societies are navigating overlapping political, security, and humanitarian crises, while at the same time experiencing with new forms of dialogue, coordination, and regional diplomacy. These patterns of confrontation and cooperation coexist in ways that challenge, of course, our traditional analytical frameworks. There is an escalation from the 12-day war to the Israeli-US strikes on Iranian facilities, as we talked about that yesterday, has exposed how fluid and interconnected the regional security environment has become. And yet, at the same time, we're seeing a growing number of diplomatic initiatives, often led from within the region, seeking to manage crisis and prevent escalation. This simultaneous movement toward contestation and negotiation captures much of the current moment, instability, but also agency. This panel is an invitation to think through these complexities collectively, to reflect on how regional actors are redefining these security priorities, how external powers engage with these evolving dynamics, and how both sets of actors might contribute to a more sustainable approach to conflict management. So we're today with 4 excellent speakers, which will bring complementary perspectives that together will offer a multidimensional reading of the region. First of all, Dr. Raz Simt, the director of the Iran and Sheet Access Research Program at the Institute for National Security Studies. Dr. Abdolrazak Divsallar, or Farzan, is a senior researcher for the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone project at UNIDIR. Ambassador Stefan Clement, Special Envoy for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament and Special Advisor on Iran Nuclear Issue. Doesn't need any presentation. And finally, Amna Ibrahim, Director for Emergency Operations and Senior Advisor to the GCC Emergency Management Center. We will begin with initial questions to each speaker and then move to an open exchange and Q&A with the audience. With that, I would like to thank our panelists for joining us. And Raz, I'll begin with you. So for decades, Israel's core objective has been to secure its borders and maintain its qualitative military edge. In the aftermath of the 12-day war and amid an escalating multi-front security environment, what is today the long-term end state in Israel towards the regional strategy, particularly in relation to Iran? Is the primary objective a return to a stable and manageable deterrence equilibrium, or has the strategic goal shifted to more a fundamental, irreversible reordering of the regional security architecture? And if so, what would the reordering entail for Israel's approach to conflict management, especially with Iran?
So, good morning. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Moving from the more than 25 degrees Celsius in Tel Aviv to Brussels. I tend to agree with you that the Israeli objectives for many years has mostly been about defending its borders. It doesn't mean, of course, that Israel was not engaged in occasional offensive operations. We saw that during the civil war in Syria. We saw that in the occasional rounds of war with Hamas in Gaza. But let's be honest. On October the 7th, 2023, in 6:29 in the morning, Israeli defense conception collapsed. And the fact is that not only Hamas was able to deal with the Israeli defense, but it also used this opportunity to take control, at least for a few hours, of significant parts of Israeli territory in the south. And we have to assume that if Hezbollah had used this opportunity to implement its own operational plan, Israel would certainly face an even more risky threat. And so the national trauma, as we can refer to it in Israel, certainly shifted Israeli strategy. And I think that it's too early to really assess how this strategy is going to evolve. But you know, I'm an historian by practice, so all we do is telling stories. So let me tell you a story. We at the INSS had a very interesting discussion in the summer of 2023, just weeks before the war in Gaza. And the aim of this discussion was to come up with recommendations for the Israeli government what to do with Hezbollah, which was considered back then as the major immediate threat. And the discussion was held not just because of the strategic military buildup of Hezbollah in the north, but it followed a series of Hezbollah provocations for several weeks and months, including the penetration of Hezbollah activists into Israel, carrying out a failed terror attack in northern Israel. Then there was the failed assassination attempt on former Defense Minister Moshe Bogi Ya'alon in Tel Aviv. And then just a few months before the war, Hezbollah set up 2 tents inside Israeli territory near the border with Lebanon. And I can tell you that the majority of the participants, including myself, by the way, recommended that Israel is not going to engage itself in a full-scale confrontation with Hezbollah. We said, okay, those provocations have to be contained in a way. Winter will come, the tents are going to be removed by the rain. We don't have to take the risk of enforcing a confrontation with Hezbollah with the arsenal of over 150,000 missiles and rockets. This is no longer the situation today. And you cannot understand the Israeli policy over the last two years in Lebanon, in Syria, in Gaza, in Iran, without understanding this shift in strategy. The problem is that when strategy shifts and changes, sometimes the pendulum swings from one extreme to another one. And so after many years of Israeli decision to try and restrain itself through 2 major terror armies, Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's very clear that Israel today is not just unwilling to accept any real threats on its borders, but Israel has zero tolerance to any potential strategic threat, whether from the borders, either it's Lebanon or Syria or Gaza, but also from far away, whether it's Iran and Iraq and Yemen. And so I really hope that at some point we will be able to balance a little bit between continuing the Israeli military efforts to make sure that no strategic threat reappears, and trying to translate, as we at the INSS recommend, to translate military achievements and security achievements into a more political, diplomatic solutions. And I think that when this Israeli new set of mind coincides with military achievements as were achieved in the summer of 2024 with Hezbollah, or during the 12-day war with Iran, it sometimes results in a sense of hubris. And that's exactly, I think, what happened in the failed attack in Qatar. I will just say one thing about how that meets the Israeli-Iranian confrontation. Look, I know that there is a tendency, by the way, not just outside Israel, but also inside Israel, mostly among the critics of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I'm not one of his supporters, I would have to say, saying that the main reason for the Israeli decision to strike Iran in June had to do with the political, personal considerations of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I totally reject this narrative. I think that we cannot understand the Israeli decision to do that regardless of the change of the Israeli strategy in the last 2 years since October the 7th. And I think, and we discussed it yesterday, I think that in order to understand the Israeli decision to strike Iran, I would say that it was 60% about the so-called window of opportunity, which allowed Israel to do that, mainly after the defeat of Hezbollah in 2024, which was the major constraint for any Israeli decision to strike Iran for many, many years. The collapse of the Assad regime, which also provided Israel with some operational opportunities. The Israeli attack in Iran in October, which managed to damage the aerial defense system in Iran. So that was 60%. 20% was about the progress made in Iran's missiles capabilities. And 20% was the intelligence detected by the Israelis and Americans concerning some breakthrough which could be used by Iran to break out to nuclear weapon. And I have to tell you that if the same intelligence about Iran's progress in its missiles capabilities or the weaponization part, if the same intelligence existed 3 years ago or 4 years ago, assuming that our operational capabilities were more of the same, I'm not sure that Israel would take the same decision. But I'm certain that any prime minister in Israel in June 2025 would make a decision to strike Iran, regardless if it's Netanyahu, Bennett, or Yair Lapid, because of this change of Israeli mentality. And again, I think, and we can discuss it later, that at the end of the day, we will have to find a way to make sure that we manage to balance between the continued efforts to use military force and to try and create perhaps a more stable environment or regional architectures which will make it easier for Israel to create the conditions which would contain Iranian influence and provide Israel with its security needs, not just by putting all the emphasis on military solutions.
Thank you, Raz. Very explicative. Now, let's turn to Farzam and to the broader nuclear aspect. Your recent report, Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Middle East, the role of WMD Free Zone Initiative, outlines how shifting security dynamics in the Middle East are prompting states to reassess their threat perceptions and strategies with regard to WMDs. So in light of this, how are recent developments in the regional security architecture shaping approaches to non-proliferation and arms control in the region, and more specifically, to what extent are these dynamics influencing Iran's strategic thinking about the possibility or necessity of a WMD-free zone in the Middle East?
Thank you, Ludovica, and thank you for organizing such a fruitful discussions today and also yesterday. Well, as you said, I think we all sort of agree that the WMD threat landscape in the Middle East is quite particular, if I don't call it very much unique, because of the presence of almost every type of WMD threats that you may imagine. We had in the region actually cases of non-compliance, the cases of the states not being part of the WMD treaties, in this case NPT and other treaties existing. We have been constantly facing with a threat to the nuclear infrastructures. We had the case of use of the weapons of mass destructions in the conflicts, in the conventional conflicts in the past. And let's not forget that we had also the threat of the use of nuclear weapons just in the recent years, and even when the discussions in public was taking place about a type of strikes against nuclear facilities in Iran, even at some point discussions were shifting toward, at least in some think tanks, about possible use of actually tactical nuclear weapons. So we had these experience, and then we also had a very broader risk of a possible conventional conflicts taking some sort of a nuclear component, which in this case is not about the use, it's like about risks of proliferation due to the strategic assessments of the state. So this very, I would call, comprehensive threat dynamic when we talk about WMD in the Middle East is very much, should be in consideration when we talk about regional and political developments. And I think regional security system is one of the core factors and reasons that has generated and is generating these trend landscapes. So if you allow me, I will try to just capture some of the major trends that, as you said, in our recent published report, we have tried to just a bit more elaborate and we try to say how we at least see risks evolving in the future and threat dynamics in the WMD domain will evolve in the next coming years. I think on the military front, we are facing three major trends, which some of them are very concerning. The first is that we are seeing a growing number of states seeing the necessity and urgency of restoring deterrence and trying to think about their reviewing or revisiting their deterrence models. And that's obviously at some points have components which includes nuclear deterrence. So we are seeing the rethinking of a nuclear latency, rethinking of extended deterrence concepts, even nuclear assurances, and even possibilities of full nuclear deterrence. So we are in a sort of situation that there are a lot of uncertainties about what would be the next deterrence landscape in the region. I would say we're in a period that is shaping. States are very much in the phase of revisiting their deterrence concepts, and that's quite an open question. On the same line of the military front, we are seeing a greater imbalance in the regional balance of power. And that's very much related to the fact that there are states, in this case Israel, emerging as a military power that can shape regional order through the military instrument. And that is impacting a lot the threat perceptions and assessments of other states, particularly the Arab states in general, and of course Iran. So this perception of enduring threat that is coming out of the emerging regional imbalance of a power is something very concerning, and it's something that, since we don't have any proper regional mechanism to answer that, at some point might entail the value for WMD capabilities as a way to resolve it. The third trend I would call is the continued saliency of nuclear capabilities for some states, and at least in military circles. And that is about the combination of technological shifts and operational change. We witnessed the very stark imbalance between offensive resources and defensive resources. We witnessed that the states are seeing more value in cross-domain strategies. That entails the sort of strategies that they value using different types of domains of the warfare to asymmetrically address the domain that they feel weaker in that, which in this case, at some points, nuclear element has been used by states to address some of those weaknesses in asymmetric warfare, in an asymmetric concept. So these three sort of broad military strategic thinking which are emerging, I think, have great implications on non-proliferation in the region, which necessarily is not positive, and I would say it's more a concerning dynamic. But at the same time, we have a political aspect which is a bit different from the military side. I think on the political side, we have more opportunities, and I would call it a sort of maybe a difference between military and diplomatic institutions in some of the states that's caused this. And what are these political trends? I think there's the First, one of that, which is very noticeable, and I think it's important, is about the regional aspiration for an inclusive multilateral arms control treaty. And you see that in the continuation of the UNGA mandated process in New York about the zone. Let's not forget that the conference in New York about the zone is the only multilateral format that states in the Middle East are talking about WMD and nuclear issues, chemical issues, and biological issues all together. At least most of the states, we know that Israel is not participating, but most of Middle Eastern states are there. And the fact that this process was kept intact and resiliently remained functioning during a volatile security environment is quite a telling story about that, how states are viewing the importance of that. The second political factor, I would say, is the regional agency. I see continued growth in the importance of different mediation and deconfliction or sort of de-escalation measures by states. States have very much, in different ways, smaller states in this case, mostly, have been supplementing each other's effort for mediation efforts. You see that in Egyptian diplomacy, you see that in Qatari, Omani, and Jordanian policy toward keeping some of the under risk processes. Like, for example, as I said about the zone, and there was very much active efforts of the states. I mean, the fact that the process of the zone remain intact is because there are states actively working, in this case, Egypt and Jordan, very much working in keeping the process alive and sort of isolated from risks that the regional security imposing on that. So there's a growing regional agency, or at least I may call it continued regional agency. And then there is the third political factor, which is also a very positive thing, I think, is the recognitions of the importance of the norms and international treaties. I think there are growing assessments that some of the risks and WMD risks in the region are causing because of the lack of the respect to the international norms. The attacks to the nuclear infrastructures is a stark, clear violation of those norms and has caused nuclear security concerns in the region. And that's a sort of a recognition by the regional actors that, well, maybe a regional mechanism can be a solution for that. So this is an opportunity, and I think that's an opportunity we need to take it. And then the fourth factor, which is again, I think, is positive, is about the regional reconciliations. Let's not forget that the Saudi-Iranian deal and other reconciliations remain still alive. They played a role in conflict mitigation. They were helpful in controlling the spillovers of the conflict. I mean, imagine a situation that this was the old things that happened in the region were occurring 3 or 4 years ago before the normalization taking place, and then I think we were facing with a much different security environment. However, saying all these positive things, we should also acknowledge the limits of the political processes. I mean, the core limits, I think one of the core limits is the fact that Israel remained outside many of the arms control discussions and dialogues in the region. Israel is not participating in the zone, and it's not willing to participate, at least in the current security environment, and we think that's an issue. However, I think we also need to acknowledge that despite everything that happened, states in the region are still pushing for a political solution with Israel in order to include Israeli position into the process of the zone and other multilateral formats, which is very much interesting. So in conclusion, if you allow me, Ludovica, I will say that there are discrepancies between political and military dynamics. As I said, the military side is, I think, is more toward advocating a militaristic approach and sees less value in arms control and non-proliferation in general, at least in the short term. However, in the political side, there are active diplomatic measures which seems to be a bit different from that. All in all, I should say that we are in a sort of uncertain situation because many states are revisiting their nuclear policies in the region. And we have, I should say, maybe we need to give ourselves, of course, some time to see what's the outcome of this revisiting and rethinking. Of course, that doesn't mean we should not assess it, but I think that uncertainty about this ongoing process of rethinking military strategies in the region is the top concern right now. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to the EU with Stefan. The traditional framework of the JCPOA is effectively defunct, with the E3's recent snapback decision seemingly delivering its final blow. And in parallel, as we've said many times during yesterday and today, the non-proliferation and nuclear security regime is under extreme stress following the military strikes against nuclear infrastructure and so on and so forth. With a non-proliferation and arms control toolkit that seems to be moving towards preemptive military action, economic coercion, instead of trust building and diplomacy, what the EU can do.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Ludovica, for this introduction. I thank my colleagues Raz and Fazam for setting the scene a bit. It's indeed true that what you mentioned, that we, as painful as for me to pronounce it, we live in what you could call the post-JCPOA era now, which does not mean that the situation has become much better or easier to handle. And maybe let me start by giving a few of what I see as the determining parameters of what has happened in the last 3 to 6 months has definitely totally changed the situation. But there's maybe one thing which has not changed, and I think this is also, you ask about the EU. The EU's determined conviction is still the only long-term solution to the Iranian nuclear issue can be found through diplomacy and negotiations. I think this is the only way to find a sustainable outcome of this crisis, which goes on for many decades now. And if you look now at the situation on the ground after JCPOA, and as we know, the snapback has been triggered by the E3 in late August and has then been executed end of September, which brings back all UN sanctions, but also all old resolutions on the Iranian nuclear program. But if you look at the situation on the ground, I think there's a reason for considerable concern because first of all, we don't know much, and if I say we, I also include the IAEA. We have had yesterday Rafael Grossi explaining to us about the situation, which is not at all kind of promising, because IAEA has lost a lot of knowledge, continuity of knowledge on the most sensitive nuclear sites and most sensitive nuclear assets, which also, if we consider at some point, if I may call it a positive scenario, there could be some negotiations again and some negotiated outcome, how to monitor and verify a future agreement will face massive challenges in terms of how to recover the knowledge, how to define a new baseline for verification and monitoring in order to really reassure about the peaceful nature of the Iranian nuclear program, which is the final objective of all this exercise. Secondly, of course, I think if you look at the kind of ingredients for success which made JCPOA possible, and one of these ingredients for success was for sure at that time in 2012, 2015, the unity of the 3+3. There was a format in place, which, by the way, this format did not fall from heaven. This format was the development of this format was a very long and tenuous diplomatic effort, which started in 2002, 2003, and only at some point resulted in full commitment by all these 3+3 to tackle this problem together and to face Iran with a certain level of unity. And this format, of course, I don't have to explain into detail, in more detail. This format has been totally shattered in the last couple of years. There is no unity. There's what is maybe at this point a very different parameter, a parameter which has changed to the better. I think if you look at 2015, when JCPOA was adopted, I would say almost all countries in the region were skeptical, critical, hostile to JCPOA for different reasons, which I personally don't find justified, but there's no need to go into this today. In the last few years, we have seen that many countries in the region have been trying to improve their relations with Iran, to seek some kind of coexistence, even cooperation. And I very strongly believe that this kind of new environment, the countries in the region, they will have to play an important role in these potential future negotiations if we ever get to them. And I think this is also, of course, I come from a European background. This is a bit kind of the model which was developed and successfully implemented in Europe after the Second World War, the European Atomic Energy Community working together and trying to control nuclear energy together. I mean, there are of course many differences, many counter-arguments can be made, but I think the cooperative approach of a multinational nuclear industry is maybe the potential way forward in this region. From an EU angle, of course, as I said before, the EU High Representative remains committed to diplomacy and in this way implementing the EU kind of overall approach. And of course, the High Representative has some role in accordance with existing resolutions, which came back as a kind of facilitator of these discussions. And of course, we are, together with partners, we are thinking about how to implement this. At the moment, of course, as it was really pointed out also by the IAEA DG yesterday, the situation does not look very promising. But I'm also sure that this is a problem, the kind of Iranian nuclear program, if not addressed, could also make the region more volatile, more dangerous. So maybe I leave it at this point. I know that I've put maybe more questions in space than answers, but maybe in the Q&A session, this is a very good opportunity to further elaborate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stefan. Very clear. And finally, Amna, I'd like to bring you to the discussion with a question on regional diplomacy and crisis management from a Gulf perspective. The latest regional crises have underscored the country's structural vulnerability, and from your perspective as Director for Emergency Operations and Senior Advisor to the GCC Emergency Management Center, how are Gulf states strengthening crisis management and regional coordination for emergencies? Are there concrete efforts to build joint response mechanisms, and what challenges remain in making regional coordination more effective?
Thank you. Is my mic working? Okay. So if we can pull up the PowerPoint slides, I just want to go over this because I think the emergency management wing of the GCC has some very solid representations of the priorities of our member states. Just for those who are not very familiar with the region, the Gulf Cooperation Council represents 6 member states. It starts with Kuwait, and then it goes down. So Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. These are few states, but they are very powerful, wealthy states. And if we can go to the next slide. Sorry, I don't have a mouse or anything. Next, sorry. And then our office is in charge of planning and response. So everything in terms of preparing for an incident, planning the actual emergency response plans of the bloc for a significant number of threats within an official risk registry, which I'll show you in a second. And then the mechanism for information exchange and resource management if an incident were to occur within that risk registry. So we're a support group to the member states. We don't deploy ourselves, but we coordinate any response between the member states. For an incident to fall within our mandate, it has to be a transboundary incident, or it needs to overwhelm one state's capacity to respond in which there is an official request for assistance, either from another member state or directly to us. So if there's a missile attack, but it's under control, our only SOP in that situation is to send an inquiry form to the member state where we request a situational report. We ask them, are you okay? What's going on? And do you need assistance? And if everything is under control, that's where our SOP stops. That was not the case during the 12-day war in June. There was very high fear of radiological release that would then impact our side of the Gulf, the Arab Gulf. And it was a partial activation of our emergency protocol. Partial activation means that we are there day and night, about 20 out of the 24 hours of the day, and that we have specific, it activates our radiological and nuclear response plan, basically. That means that there are situational reports daily. There is constant monitoring of news and incidents. There are several attempts made to the IAEA during that time, through us directly and through our member states, for situational reports on the attacks happening on Iranian nuclear facilities. And the attacks happening on Israel as well, actually, because one of our member states actually has a very close border to Israel. And because of the nature of these attacks, every single day, we didn't know what they were going to hit. There are also high water concerns during the 12-day war. A lot of that, as experts in the field, we might shrug off. We know how water acts as a buffer to radiological material and how slow that kind of contamination may be. But the public does not, and policymakers in those member states do not. And this is a very water-scarce region. There isn't a river or a stream or a lake that provides alternative water source. Everything runs on desalination plants. And so there was an investigation into whether or not desalination plants in the region are able to decontaminate radiological material. Several member states assisted with that and provided experts on this, and then there was a communique on this issue specifically. Every single day there were radiological reports. Sorry, just to very quickly note, if you look at our risk registry, yes, CBRNE-related incidents, are especially radiological nuclear incidents, are repeatedly outlined in the risk registry. So number 2, number 6, and number 8. It's the only incident type that is repeated in the registry. That's why it's of such high significance and priority to the center. But this risk registry is actually done by priority. So number 1 is actually the top threat perception in the region. The risk registry isn't produced in-house. It's produced through a working group from the member states, an expert working group from the member states that we lead as the management center. So it's actually public health risks are number 1. But again, radiological nuclear being cited in multiple ways, that was a specific, intentional, and very deliberate choice there, was to not group them into one risk, but actually separate them in terms of intent behind the incident and incident type of radiological, and then separate those out. Just very important to note that, because aggression of WMD is higher rated than an accident in the risk registry. And the E was added last year. So this is updated every 3 years. The last update was in 2024. So the kind of explosive and high yield explosions were only recently added. Cyber attacks were also only recently added. We didn't even have a cybersecurity team before 2024. Now, there is a cybersecurity team at the Secretariat for other cybersecurity incidents, but in terms of this nature of threat, it didn't exist. So these are some of our first most projects and most successful projects. And I have to say, having Clement here, these are all EU projects. So one of the closest partners to the GCC is actually, in fact, the EU in terms of operationally. We have a radiological exchange platform that was adopted from EU RDEP, the EU system for information exchange when it comes to radiological levels in the region. We have connected all of the airborne radiological sensors that exist in the region to that system. The only sensors that are not connected to GCC RDEP at this point are military sensors. So we do have some water sensors, radiological sensors, from different military entities in the region. Those are on their own tablets and their own systems, because that's a mandate from those ministries of defense to have their own systems. But in terms of the GCC platform, they're all of the different civilian atmosphere radiological sensing data. We do have a simulator, JRODIS, that's also been adopted from the EU. That was a service from the EU to the GCC that we worked on with them. And every single day during the 12-day war, we were sending out models to the member states. Even though the model can give you a picture for 72 hours ahead of time, we were repeating it every single day based on the latest weather update at a specific time, and then escalating that and circulating it to the member states. We were also receiving the modeling pictures and data from our member states that also have this capability, and comparing notes as to, why were their images different, what were they looking at, what we were looking at, when were they the same. And that was happening daily with the member states. And lastly is the emergency response plan. The emergency response plan was developed in 2016. At the time, it was outsourced. The capabilities of the region, yes, these are wealthy states, but they are very, very young states. And the ability of the member states to develop these mechanisms is recent. We now have an expert working group. There was an expert working group in 2016 for this plan, but at the time, the expert working group decided to outsource it to a private company. This year, things are different. The capabilities of the member states, they now all have regulators or regulating entities. They have, nuclear scientists and radiological scientists. And the expert working group today, led by our team, it's myself and our director of plans, who, by the way, is also a female, are leading the emergency response plan for the region for radiological and nuclear incidents. So we hold this expert working group. We decide what goes into the new plan, what gets taken out. Some things were taken out, what to focus on, what the priority is. One of the biggest new additions, I would say, is public communication and what the SOPs are for communicating information upwards to the highest levels in ministries of interior, ministries of health, and ministries of defense. And then how that information will be shared. So that's a new addition to the new plan. The plan is in draft right now. We probably finalize it by January. So we kick off 2026 with a regional response plan that is actually developed by the member states themselves through the GCC entity. We're doing the same thing with the chemical and bio. That's our top priority for next year as well. We're doing it underneath the public health umbrella because that way we kick off multiple different threats at the same time. Sorry, I'm going backwards. And then I'll just end with just some kind of idea of what these, if you are familiar with the EU systems, these are copy-paste EU platforms that are adapted to the GCC. Now, what's missing, especially in terms of your question, is information exchange with surrounding states. What kind of information can we get from Iraqi counterparts, from Yemeni counterparts, from Iranian counterparts? I have to say, and this is unfortunate, that the 12-day war and the way in which the events unfolded, whether with Israel or with Iran, have set us back. I understand the perspective that this should be kind of galvanizing more and closer cooperation because we've seen how important an early warning system is. The early warning system helped us a lot amongst the member states. But in order to extend that beyond the region, there are a lot of people who will say, that's a great confidence building measure. But the fact is that you need a baseline level of trust to develop that confidence building measures. And that was set back during that 12-day war. I don't believe that we are any closer or any more motivated to working with with countries outside of the member states, but relevant to the region, on sharing information. Because there were multiple times where attempts were made to get information during that war, and all failed. Every attempt failed. Whether it was multilaterally as a bloc, whether it was bilaterally through our member states. So today the decision really is that member states of the GCC will pursue and continue to pursue based on their own state sovereign policy. But as a bloc, and this doesn't come from the Secretariat, remember our decisions as a bloc come from the actual member states. So it's really a mandate from the member states to take these issues with surrounding areas bilaterally and no longer multilaterally. So that's just, a not optimistic picture, but a realistic picture of where the bloc is today.
No, thank you very much, Amna. I think you added a very useful and important dimension to our discussion, and there are so many overlapping questions, between our regions. I mean, I've been, we've been hearing yesterday. I mean, there was not a lot of optimism yesterday too, but I think there are a lot of commonalities when it comes to the difficulties of, implementing technical aspects and the coordination and collaboration, especially within, a bloc sometimes. So we do have 35 minutes for a Q&A. So I'll open the discussion now. If you want to raise a question, just raise your hand. Wow.
Oh, back there, there's some questions.
Polina,
I can try without microphone.
you have it.
Oh, okay. Okay, Polina Sinevets, the Director of Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. Probably my question, I mean, they were beautifully structured and perfectly balanced. My question is referring to Farzam's kind of intriguing balance of military and political interests which are dominating in the region. What do you think the scale would go to more? I understand that things will may go in different directions. I mean, in favor of Iran stepping over nuclear threshold or against? I know that it's a very long way, along a lot of yes, buts and no's, but what's your personal perception, whether it's possible for Iran to step over this threshold, and which circumstances, which events may really accelerate that? Something like that. I will also be very grateful if other speakers can add their opinions on that, because I'm very intrigued by that long dialogue of Iran and Israel over the Iranian nuclear program. Thank you.
Any other questions, or we can... Okay, Farzam, do you want to answer?
Thank you, Polina, for your question. I mean, I was asked not to talk too much about Iran, but you raised it, and it seems I need to answer your question. I think, honestly, I'm thinking that the Iranian system in general, that we need to realize that when we talk about the nuclear calculus in the Iranian side, at least there are four major stakeholders with different impressions of the value of a nuclear deterrence exist in the country. There's the nuclear industry, the public opinion, political system, and the military, and all have different values. I think the 12-day war very much, and I personally think that the military establishment is actually the main opposition to the nuclear deterrence in Iran. And that simply goes back to the idea that having a nuclear deterrence means that or you need to do it in a clandestine way that basically conventional support of this process of weaponization is not needed, which in the case of Iran now doesn't exist, at time might be. And this implies that for having a nuclear deterrence, you need other sets of conventional capabilities, including delivery system, including the command and control system, including the passive defense, first strike capability, at least absorbing the first strike capability, which Iran doesn't have none of them. I mean, I would say that even about the delivery system, there is no military general, I think, ready to put a warhead on a missile that has 20 or 30% rate of failure and can drop in Iraq or in another region inside the country. So there are other prerequisites for nuclear deterrence, which in the case of Iran does not exist. Adding to that, there is an impression, we may not agree with that, but there is an impression that the conventional deterrence is working. And it's still, there is this impression. I know that we had a discussion with Roz, the Israeli perspective is different on that. And the perspective outside Iran is obviously different. But there is an impression in the system, at least among military elites, that there are adjustments needed for the conventional forces, the missile forces, especially on a targeting system and an operational doctrine of the missile forces. There is the reality that the Iranian overall military capability was not involved in the war. Basically, there is no involvement of the naval forces, there's no involvement of many other branches of Iranian military in total. Basically, it's only one branch of IRGC that fought with Israel alone. And that's an important factor in the perception of the country's capacity in its conventional force. That means that that means that there's no risk of overall failure of deterrence from the Iranian military establishment that requires it to move toward a nuclear deterrence. Adding to that is the fact that there is a rethinking, as I said in my initial discussions, there is a rethinking about really the value of a nuclear latency and what nuclear latency means if it already caused a sort of like war for Iran, actually brought a war. So I think here is the discrepancy between the political establishment and the military establishment inside Iran is taking place. That for politicians, the nuclear latency is a political leverage. It has a lot of value. However, there is certain level of pushbacks from the military that, well, we may not need to move to some certain directions. So all in all, I would say that I personally think we did not have, I understand the Israeli perspective that the weaponization components of the program were taking place. The nuclear materials were constructed or were produced beyond certain thresholds that they should have not been. However, my assessment is that all of these were, rather than being an actual military project, because of whatever I said, because of that impression of the lack of a need and risks entailing with that and everything else, they were more unwise, sort of unmeasured nuclear strategy that was seen as a political tool. So I'm not sure if they are really moving toward that scenario now. However, that doesn't reject the fact that I think the country's policy in general is moving toward reestablishing its political leverage. Iran will not negotiate in the current situation. They need to have their own perception of the political leverage, and that means that leverage could be created by some nuclear elements. That does not mean building a nuclear warhead, but by rebuilding some of the capabilities or retaking the control over some of the assets that has been destroyed or are not accessible right now, and then maybe starting with a negotiation. So still, I think the overall assessment in Iran is that there should be a diplomatic process, but that's not the time for it now because there are not proper political initiatives out there. U.S. has a completely different perspective. From the U.S. perspective, things are resolved. There's no need to engage in a discussion and give something to Iranian, and that's not how I think the Iranian system accepts it. And as a result, we were agreeing with Ross yesterday that unfortunately that means that both sides have very, very different understanding of the situation, and risks are very much consistently be there in the coming months and maybe years.
So I have to share Stefan's concerns concerning the post-JCPOA situation in Iran. From the Israeli perspective, I think there are three main concerns right now. One is the concern of possible miscalculation between Israel and Iran, certainly due to the fact that there are no direct channels of communication. So we just recently heard that Israel tried to relay some messages to Iran through the Russians saying we're not going to attack you unless you try to reconstitute your nuclear capabilities. But that perhaps worked a few weeks ago. I'm not sure it's going to work forever. And so that's one concern. The second concern is that at some point, Iran might take some risky decisions which could trigger an Israeli or even a US retaliation. And I think that the current status quo is not sustainable for much longer. Because at some point, I suspect that the Iranians, due to the fact that there are still 3 years at least for Trump's presidency, they might reach the conclusion that in order to get out of this current situation, which certainly puts some constraints on the Iranian economy and decision-making, they might have to take some decisions to encourage diplomacy or political moving forward. And at this point, I certainly believe that it's going to be very difficult for Israel not to do anything. So if, for example, in a matter of months or next year, Iran will take a decision to re-enrich uranium, this would pose a major dilemma on Israel, whether to restrike Iran, or whether to wait to see what the Americans are going to do. But I'm not sure that the current status quo can be sustained. And the third concern, which goes back to what you asked, is the risk of changing Iran's nuclear doctrine. And I have to say that while I certainly share the view that the military establishment in Iran seems to understand the difference between acquiring a nuclear device and having a full operational capability to nuclear capability, we cannot ignore the fact that even before the 12-day war, there were more and more voices in Iran, and not just among the hardliners, even among the more pragmatic circles inside Iran, saying, look, we can no longer deter Israel through our proxies. It was very evident during the 12-day war. I can tell you that in dozens of simulations and war games I participated in the last 20 years concerning what will happen when Israel strikes the nuclear facilities in Iran. The major concern in Israel has always been not what Iran is going to do, but what Hezbollah is going to do. And the fact that Israel could make a decision to strike Iran without taking into consideration the response by Hezbollah actually detests to the fact that Iran lost its ability to deter Israel through its so-called axis of resistance. And then it goes back to the issue of missiles. Now, I certainly agree that from the Iranian point of view, they think even today, even more than before, that the missile component was the only one which was in a way successful. But let me remind you all, the first Iranian attack on Israel in April, following the killing of Iranian General Hassan Mahdavi in Damascus. I remember former IRGC Commander Salami saying back then, after the attack, we managed to force a new equation of deterrence on the Israelis, on the Zionists, and whenever the Israelis decide to kill an Iranian general or to strike Iranian interests, whether inside Iran or outside Iran, we will use military force against that. Well, it didn't happen. After the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and Fuad Shukr, the chief of staff of Hezbollah, Iran did not retaliate. And even during the 12-day war, and here certainly there is a big difference between the way the Iranians see their achievements and the Israelis, because in Israel, I have to say, the overall sense is that we were expecting Iran to retaliate to Israeli attack by thousands of missiles with hundreds of casualties inside Israel. And at the end of the day, mainly due to the Israeli aerial superiority, there were about 500 missiles being launched from Iran, not because they didn't want to do that, but because they couldn't do that, and about 30 casualties all over the world. So even before the war, there were voices saying, okay, if we cannot deter Israel through our proxies and even through our missiles, the only ultimate deterrence would be to give up the idea of a threshold state and move forward to breaking out to a weapon. Now, I'm not sure they're going to do that, because any decision in Tehran has to take into consideration both the willingness and determination by both Israel and the United States to use military force, and also the so-called intelligence infiltration to Iran's nuclear program. But I cannot rule out the possibility that at some point the Iranian leadership, with or without the military establishment approval, would make a decision to change Iran's doctrine. And my last word would be that we are probably approaching the end of Ali Khamenei's era as the supreme leader. I mean, he's 86. Iranian clerics tend to live longer, but still, we're approaching the post-Khamenei era, and I'm not sure that the next leader in Iran, regardless of who is going to be, will be as cautious as Khamenei has usually been since 1989, since he took control.
Stefan, would you?
Thank you very much. And to build a bit on what Fazem and Ras have been saying on the Iranian internal situation, the decision making, I think there are two parameters which have to be absolutely kept in mind. And one is, of course, this kind of post-12-day war kind of paralysis in the internal decision making. I think there have been new structures have been set up, and a shift of of power has also happened towards the Supreme National Security Council, which is even further visible than it was before. And my impression is that at the moment there's a very slow or not at all a decision-making process in place, and this is of course something which will not go on forever. And on the nuclear dimension as such, if I go back pre-JCPOA times, at that time Iran often brought forward the famous fatwa against nuclear weapons, and I remember very well that at that time the fatwa was really something which, at least from Iranian participants, politically was very much respected. Nobody in 2014-15 would have dared to put the fatwa in question or speak about the nuclear doctrine. If you look back, and Ras is absolutely correct, this precedes the 12-day war, there was a very animated discussion about the future of the fatwa, the nuclear doctrine. So I think this is not good news in general terms. And I also believe there's a high risk that further instability, further escalation may happen in the next couple of months if there's not any new attempt for a negotiated solution. At the same time, of course, it is also correct that Iran has been weakened on many fronts, and past behavior has always kind of been seen as Iran is not negotiating from a perspective of weakness, but only from a perspective of strength. So to rebuild strengths, there are different ways, of course, but it's unclear at this point what kind of nuclear developments could happen inside Iran in order to bring them back to what they would consider as a starting point to negotiate from strengths. But I would like also to comment and to thank Amna for the elements she brought in, because I think this is exactly what I was referring before and not illustrating so well. I think this is a moment where cooperation and some attempts by countries who have, at least in an embryonic or even more increased way, tried to develop common structures and common initiatives. And I'm very happy, of course, to hear that this is all copy-paste EU. I'm sure improvements can be made, because nobody is perfect. And I think the only point which you also made, which is maybe interesting to further explore, when you said, and I'm fully aware that this happened, that the best emergency system in place is only as good as the data you get, and the data also from the outside. And this is a very compact region, and there are other countries around. So you need absolutely this other data. At the same time, you said trust is needed to get this data. If I look back, and no one in this room, I think, was around when the Second World War ended, there was a lot of mistrust in Europe, and still in a couple of years it was possible to build these kind of structures and to build trust. I'm fully aware that, of course, trust can be destroyed very quickly and is very difficult to build, but just the absence of trust as such cannot be used in the long term not to do anything. And this is but in general, I'm very positively impressed, and thank you very much for these concrete contributions.
Yeah, sure.
I will say, as the GCC, the amount of, and the volume and the sensitivity of the data being exchanged and of the individuals present in the room continues to be of higher quality and of significance every single few months. And really it's a testament to, as the competencies and capabilities internally, domestically of the member states increases, you see that reflected right in front of you in the room. And as the GCC as an entity, you know, as a bloc, at the secretariat level, as that gets reflected into the secretariat, it then continues to build on itself as well. We have gotten a lot more attention all of a sudden and a lot more resources because of our promptness and our management with the member states during the 12-day war. This is what needs to happen on a wider scope. So our old radiological plan for the water emergency elements of radiological release were developed with two entities, ROPMI and MEMAC. And they were done so on purpose because they wanted to include states that were not GCC member states, but also shared those waters. So MEMAC and ROPMI also include Iraq and Iran. It is a lot harder this time. And if you look at where MEMAC is today or where ROPMI is today, they are under severe challenges to coordinate and to continue developing their broader regional planning because of the political dynamics in the region. At the end of the day, just because we work on the operational level and somewhat on the strategic level, that political level is always going to influence how far we can go and what we can implement.
Okay, we do have two questions. Sibyl?
Sibylle Bauer from CIPRI. So thank you very much to the panel for a very interesting and constructive discussion on this very difficult subject. I wanted to ask each of the panelists to outline their worst case and best case scenario for the region, and how do we get from A to B? Because a lot of the discussions I've participated in are actually quite frustrating, it's not so easy for people to come up with suggestions. A lot of people say, okay, now that we are here now, how do we have a constructive way forward? And one specific question also as part of that is there was reference that there are no direct contacts between Iran and Israel. But what would it take for both sides to have those direct contacts? Thank you.
Do you want to start, Raz?
Yeah, so concerning the second part of your questions, I'm afraid that as long as Iran is ruled by this particular supreme leader, who has any intentions not just to recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist, but is very much obsessed with the issue of Israel. And it's, in my view, it's not just an ideological vision. I think what we saw 2 years ago was the implementation of one of two operational plans approved by the Supreme Leader, although the timing was surprising from the Iranian point of view, to make sure that it's not just a vision. So I think it will take, first of all, not necessarily a regime change, but a change within the regime in Iran to make it easier to even move forward to some kind of track two, perhaps, engagement between the two states. Look, I'm usually not very optimistic, I have to say. Dealing 30 years with Iran doesn't give you too many reasons to be optimistic. I think that my concern is that if we, and we I mean Israel as a major player in the region, but not just Israel, if we don't use this so-called window of opportunity following the end of the war in Gaza, following the defeat of Hezbollah a year ago, following the 12-day war, if we don't move forward to translate some of the military and operational achievements into a more stable status quo in the Middle East, which will mean going back to political talks concerning the Palestinian issue, including with the Palestinian Authority, going back to talks about the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, allowing the Lebanese government, which for the first time I think is very serious in its attempts to disarm Hezbollah or to move forward in this direction. But it's not enough to use military force, although military force is certainly part of the way to do that. But it will take more than that also from the US part, from the Gulf states, in order to provide the states in the region, the Lebanese state, the Iraqi state, the Syrian state, the way to come up with a road plan which will make the more moderate players in the region and allow them to move forward to the creation of some kind of regional architectures which will put more emphasis on the economic and political development rather than just using the military force. But I have to tell you, I'm not sure it's going to be possible under this current government in Israel. I'm not sure it's going to be possible due to the fact that Hezbollah and the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen insist on preserving their military force. I certainly hope that at some point we will be able to move forward to a more political track.
Thank you for your very stimulating question about best scenarios and worst case scenarios. I think the best case scenario to me is very much clear. That's the time that the states inclusively agree to discuss about their WMD capabilities. In this case, I think I should share the Arab states and Iran's perspective in this case about the zone in which Israel tomorrow can join, start a nuclear disarmament, and I think many issues will be resolved in the region. That's one, I think, difficult fact, but like very best scenario case if you want to imagine. But adding to that, I think that generally, maybe I'm not sure about this terminology, but I think region overall requires a sort of a strategic stability discussion. Why I'm saying this, because I think the problem is many times we talk about the missiles. I think we need to talk about a standoff offensive capabilities overall in the region. I think we need to move on to the discussions that it doesn't matter what delivery system, but it needs to be discussions about the capabilities of each state to have a proper regional balance which can be agreed by different actors. That's not where we are right now, and that's why states talk about different delivery systems. Sometimes, well, they say missiles are not good. However, an air-propelled strike that can do 1,500 kilometers or 2,000 kilometers a strike is okay. So I think that discrepancy on how offensive capabilities and standoff capabilities are perceived is a source of a problem. And the best future can be a time that the region generally agrees to some limits about offensive standoff capabilities, and at the same time discuss the full disarmament of WMD capabilities existing in the region. We're not there, and I think we're very far from that. That's not the current reality. But worst case scenario, I think, is twofold. For me, worst case scenario is that we justify non-proliferation for waging the war. I think the whole argument of non-proliferation is that we don't want to have a war, and we want to prevent the war. So if we just use that argument to make the war and just like create rounds of a crisis over the region, I think that's against the philosophy of it, and it's like the logic of it. So that is sort of we are seeing in the region right now, but also extending to that worst case scenario, I think we could envision a region having, as I was saying, we have uncertainties about where deterrence models are moving in the region. And that might be including having different nuclear postures in the region, from nuclear deterrence to nuclear sharing even. And that's, I think, the worst case situation, because it brings external actors even in a more stronger position in defining the strategic situation in the region. About Iran and Israel, I share a bit different view with Ross here. I think there is appetite both in Tehran and Jerusalem about keeping the status quo, and I can say there has been a bit of attempt on very indirect communication between the parties. And that has been done through the messagings, through different measures, but also through a bit of more relaxed position in participating in some of the meetings which can be used for signaling and messaging. And I think this is a new thing. It was not here, it was not part of the reality a year ago. Now I see that there is a bit of interest to sort of agreeing to sit on an umbrella of a multilateral formats that might provide a chance of a sort of signaling directly between the parties, but that doesn't mean that they're in direct diplomatic talk. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that this is interesting for me to observe it because it shows that it seems both sides are sort of, at least for the moment and in the short term, they want to keep the status quo and they see a value in sort of a limited presence together in some formats.
Worst scenario and best scenario.
Thank you. I mean, I guess from a European Union perspective, the worst case scenario, and this is, by the way, one of the key reasons why EU has invested so much in addressing the Iran nuclear issue in the past 20 years, is of course a nuclear arms race in the region, which would make the region unstable, which could spread to other regions and create enormous instability and risk. So I think this is absolutely the key driver why so much effort was invested by the European Union, but also by others. The best case scenario, a far more difficult question, and then of course even to paint such a scenario, how to get there, is of course based again on what was said before, is some kind of cooperation in the region. And this cooperation, by the way, does not necessarily have to cover everyone from the beginning. So I think there could be some contamination in a positive sense if there's some economic model, some kind of cooperation in some areas of modern technology, which basically gives some more prosperity and some purpose to the region. I think this could also spread to other places. I, of course, do not want to escape the most difficult question you ask is about Iran-Israel. I think we are far from having, I mean, communication is one thing, but I think the key issue is, and I think this question was asked very often when JCPOA was criticized after 2015, how can JCPOA work if Iran does not even recognize the right of existence of one country in the region? So I think there should be some acquiescence at least to each other, and I think while maybe not there to 100% when JCPOA was in place, at least there was more fertile ground for, there were still a lot of problems with proxy and that, but there was still maybe some very basic start of a momentum to walk into such direction. Many may deny this, but from internal discussion, I saw some very small glimpse of hope in this direction, which did not manifest because JCPOA was put at risk in the beginning. In the long term, I think, of course, all countries in the region would have to be part of this kind of what I would call a big project, but it does not mean that it could not succeed if only some countries, and I'm encouraged once again by what I see happening in the GCC context now. This could indeed be the seed for something which could go much further in the longer term.
I'm going to start with worst case, like finally, at least for once, end on a positive note instead of a negative note. So this doesn't stem from the 12-day war. It actually stems from the kind of Russia-Ukraine conflict. And I think that's where it started. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, especially when you look at the nuclear dynamics of that and the missile attacks in that scenario, there's a very, I will say, dark and sinister side effect that I think warfare today is onto. And it's a very actually terrifying, truly terrifying phenomenon. The ability to attack a nuclear site just enough where you can calculate how much or how little radiological release, but hit it just enough to make the news and to create mass hysteria. And to force not just the state that is attacked, but neighboring states to activate emergency protocol because you know that is the standard in nuclear emergency response and radiological emergency response. You have to activate emergency protocol even if there is no radiological release, if a site is hit. And aggressive states are onto that and are onto what kind of political pressure that applies, not only on the state attacked, but also on states in the region, and what kind of political pressure you gain by doing that to the region. This started with Russia-Ukraine, but it absolutely was applied regularly in the 12-day war. There were times where we'd be on the phone, I'd get a call, and specifically the statement would be, Bushehr has been attacked. Just enough so that we have to go into a frenzy and we have to coordinate, only for 6 hours later to finally have a confirmation that nothing on the site has actually been attacked, but it was enough to say that Bushehr was attacked. The amount of pressure you then applied on Gulf neighboring states and the diplomatic protocols, the political channels, and the operational channels that you just forced them to pursue is a terrifying new reality, because you can do that now in so many different ways. The electronic jamming and what that causes and disruptions that causes in the maritime space, because it affects internationally. You are now applying international pressure on the entire world by just electronically jamming enough to get one vessel incident. But guess what? That vessel is registered internationally, and it belongs to a country on the other side of the world, and you've just applied that pressure internationally. Those kinds of dynamics in warfare today, those psychological and political dynamics that can be directly implemented through warfare, are very dangerous. And to me, that is the worst case scenario, is that we continue to be more and more genius at how to harm and how to force countries into difficult positions. It also is really truly a matter of trust. You know, talking Iran, Israel, and these are states that have not gotten along for decades. But when you look at what happened, Iran attacked Qatar. They did not attack a signatory to the Abraham Accords. They did not attack a state that they are in low-level communication with. They attacked one of the GCC member states that is in the most constant communication with Iran at the highest level, right? The prime minister had visited Iran only a few days before. And that's who they attacked. So if that is what will happen to you when you have been regularly working with Iran, and you have not just a mechanism with, these are all the echelons of a relationship, trade, everything, that leaves very little room for confidence-building measures. Because those confidence-building measures did exist between that duo. Also, for the best-case scenario, and I'll end on this, and they're really, truly, this is not, I know it's so hard for me to be the one saying this because it comes across so biased, but truly the Gulf region is an example of when you direct resources to development, to youth, to education, and to a pipeline from education and to occupations. The growth and the dynamics when you use your small teams for diplomatic ends to resolve conflict and mediate, we've really shown a lot in terms of what you can do positive and productively. And it really truly is a hope that the countries around us share in that vision and sign on to that prosperity vision, because that's what the offer is. The offer is to the neighboring states. If you look at, the Saudi Arabian-Iranian deal that was struck, that is the offer of shared prosperity. Yes, these countries are wealthy and they're willing to share that wealth and live in a stable region. It's not an idealism. It's very much a realism. We know that in order to have long-term economic and development stability, you need political stability. It's in self-interest, if you will, to stabilize the surrounding states and to create prosperity there to provide more opportunities. If you don't want to buy a value-oriented, narrative, buy a self-interest narrative. What's more important? Having secret nuclear sites and creating, all of this tension around what you have where? I mean, today, there is no information on where things are truly, verifiably. Or an entire population that has access to travel, has access to jobs, and is willing to rebuild your state with you, and partners in that vision. That's what the best case scenario is to me.
Thank you, Amina. Round of applause for the panel. Yeah, thank you very much. So.